The Martian by Andy Weir, 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James, The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield, Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. All these works of literature are now quite well known, some on the border of being cultural phenomena. Despite their disparate subject matter, all four of these works intersect at a meaningful point. They were all initially self-published. These, along with a plethora of other success stories, serve as inspiration for a multitude of aspiring authors who have chosen to self-publish their work. Our podcast, Homespun Script, is dedicated to telling their stories, talking with them about their work, and listening to their experiences as self-published authors. The goal is simple: provide indie and self-published authors with a platform to promote themselves and their work. While providing this space hopefully does help, we encourage all our listeners to further support these authors by writing positive and engaging reviews of their work on a platform we all know of but will remain nameless. Doing so is a simple, easy, and direct way of supporting them. And now, on to our guest. Hello and welcome to the podcast Homespun Script. My guest today is Rusty Miller. Rusty is the author of the novella Origins, a Knights of New Avalon story, published in 2023. The epigram to the novella introduces it far better than I ever could, and I'm quoting, "Where have all the good men gone? And where are all the gods? Where's the streetwise Hercules to fight the rising odds? Isn't there a white knight upon a fiery steed? I need a hero. Bonnie Tyler." So, Rusty, as a fellow child of the 80s, I can say with full confidence that this epigram incited a genuine feeling of emotional fist bumping on my part. I get the feeling that you put a lot of yourself into this novella Origins. You've described your journey crafting the work as and I'm quoting here, a decades-long process, rife with doubt, overanalyzing, imposter syndrome, and more. So it sounds to me like the story behind the story may be just as interesting as the story itself.
It all started at least 40 years ago. As a kid, I started drawing these characters, one of whom was called White Knight. And then sometime later, a friend and I started thinking up other comic book characters and scenarios in hopes of creating the next Batman or major superhero team, right? And I remember the first issue of Spider-Man versus Wolverine being integral to one of our creative sessions. I still have that comic, back here on the bookcase somewhere. The names, origins, details of the characters changed several times over the decades, to the point where nothing is like what it was when we started out. The current character roster and origins first started taking shape about 15 years ago, with one final update for the book, including 3 brand new supporting characters that were needed to round out the plot, things that you're not really thinking of or aware of when you get started. And that's the decades-long process in a nutshell. The doubt and the overanalyzing, the imposter syndrome is entirely about me and the way my brain and, maybe some of the people listening to this podcast internally think about their own stories or their own writing. For me personally, part of it is because I'm a visual artist. Pictures have always been easier than words and communicating face to face or anything like that. I never imagined way back when that I'd write a story. I always figured I'd draw it. If someone had said a year and a half ago that the Knights of New Avalon would first find life in a piece of prose, I'd say they didn't know what they were talking about. The different aspects of the imposter syndrome were always a speed bump for me. The perfectionism, the paralysis, the procrastination. I didn't know what imposter syndrome was way back then, but that didn't change the fact that it was present, that it was always kind of there, kind of holding me back. Myself, I was holding myself back because of this. If it had to be perfect in every way. If it wasn't perfect, people wouldn't want to read it. They wouldn't want to look at it. They wouldn't have anything to do with it. And if it wasn't perfect, I'd freeze up. I'd overanalyze. I'd figure, how can I make this perfect? And I doubt myself. And then, once I froze up, it would take forever to get past that. And then, there was always always trying to please people. I talk about the ideas, and I was so inspired by pop culture and the things that I loved. But I didn't yet know how to make an homage to them instead of cloning them directly. So people would call me out on that and be like, oh, it's this and it's that. And that, that criticism really just knocked me down. And it would take a long period of time for me to even want to get back into it. Not that I didn't love it, not that I didn't love the characters or I wasn't hoping to do it. It just took forever to get past those mental blocks to get back into the right headspace to move forward. And for, creative people, whether it's visual, words, whatever we're creating with, I find more and more that that's just a common issue with people, that creative mindset of these, just having these moments of great doubt, even though there's also the great skill behind it. And I wish there was a simple way for people to get past that, but it seems like it's one of those personal journeys that everyone has to kind of find their own way, unfortunately. And then as I got older, I stopped drawing, the way I used to. Job, life, other priorities kind of took over and started losing those drawing skills because I did not have the time to put into it like I used to. And, losing those skills didn't help. It really just compounded things because that's what I used to be known for when I was a kid. I was the odd, quiet kid that could draw really well. And then suddenly I wasn't anymore. And that just did not make things easy for the entire process.
Yeah. I love the story. I think it's it's a post-log to your book where you say your first comic book was, or your first, I guess, frame for a comic book. Sorry, my cat just sneezed. Your first frame for a comic book you drew when you were 3 years old, and it was on the underside of a coffee table, and you gave your brother credit for it.
Well, I wouldn't say credit.
Okay, yeah, that was meant facetiously, but it amused me.
So I was 3, and I crawled under the coffee table with a crayon in hand. I must have just gotten done watching an episode of the Adam West Batman because I drew a bat rocket, nose cone, fuselage, wings, the whole 9 yards. And then I go to start signing my name. I do the R, the U, the Y, or the R and the U. And then I thought halfway through as I'm finishing the U, oh, if I sign my name, I'm going to get in trouble because I'm not supposed to be drawing on this. And my brother, who was about a year old at the time, his name is Ryan. So I just extended the legs on the R, put a little post under the U to turn it into a Y. And I signed his name thinking I'm in the clear. I don't have to worry about it. And for a long time, I wasn't in the clear because it was under the coffee table. No one saw it until they went to move the coffee table, picked it up, and there it was. And all of a sudden, it's like, what is this? Why is this here? Who did this? We know it wasn't Ryan because clearly that's not his handwriting, and he's one. He doesn't pick up crayons. So
Ryan was still in a stage where he wasn't in a position to draw or write anything when it was discovered.
He was barely mobile at that point, And the fun thing is I didn't get in trouble. It was so laughable they couldn't help but just kind of get a kick out of it. Yeah. And then years and years later, my parents, for whatever reason, still have this hideous 70s kind of Western coffee table. And my dad is refinishing it. And instead of getting rid of the crayon on the bottom, he actually preserved it.
Oh, I would too. Yeah.
He preserved it and he showed it to me. And I thought that was
for him.
Really great. So yeah, I didn't draw on walls with crayons when I was a kid. That didn't happen until I was in high school with that. And they were kind of okay with that just because it helped sell the place when we bought a different place. Um,
Oh.
the Keaton Batman had just come out, and I had put this massive Batman mural right in the middle of the wall. And they were a little upset because the art supplies were expensive. We didn't have much.
Mhm.
But when we sold the place, the family that came in had a preteen boy, and he took one look at the wall. It was like he thought that was awesome.
Oh.
So it helped. It helped. So
Mhm.
that kind of got me out of hot water with it.
Yeah. Well, I think that story is just as awesome about your Batman mural being a selling point for the house, and specifically because like the Wright family came in who had
Mhm.
the pre-teenage boys like, that is awesome. We need this house now. It's the Batman house. And if the parents had bought a different house, they never would have heard the end of it from that kid, I bet. Why didn't we get the Batman house? So, yeah, what brought you to comic books? Obviously, your artistic ability must have
Mhm.
had something to do with that.
I think my artistic kind of came from the comic books, because comic books are
Oh,
how I
okay.
learned how I first learned how to draw, by
Hmm.
tracing the comic books with tracing paper, or big sheets of blueprint paper that I got from my grandfather, who was an engineer back in the day when they still did paper blueprints.
Hmm.
This was years before I had a copy of Learn How to Draw the Marvel Way, where they teach you how to use shapes to do the head and the torso
Oh, okay.
and all of that. So yeah, I kind of got started drawing by tracing comic books.
Hmm.
Um, and Batman and Spider-Man were probably the first two big ones that I can remember getting into, probably because they had corresponding TV shows at the time.
Yeah.
And then there was also Captain America, that I guess was also about the right time period with that Captain America movie with the hang gliding motorcycle. Those late '70s Captain
Oh,
America.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just not the Hulk. The Hulk scared me. There was a car show or something that we were at, and some big actor playing the Hulk burst through this foam wall right in front of me
Hmm.
and completely
Oh.
freaked me out.
Hmm.
And that ruined the Hulk for me until I was older. But so Spider-Man, Cap, and Batman were probably the first three that I kind of got into, and yeah, tracing them is kind of where the whole love of
Hmm.
drawing started.
Hmm.
And then as I got older, I got much more into like Nightwing. Nightwing is probably the character that I'm most likely to collect anything for now. So
Hmm.
yeah, and in fact, I actually picked up two figures yesterday while I was corresponding with you. I stopped in a GameStop, and there they were. I'm like, oh, I need those. I can just grab them off the
Oh,
board, and there we go. So
cool. Yeah, the Hulk always confused me when I was growing up. I think mainly because of the morally gray status he held. He's never really, I couldn't pin him down as either a good guy or a bad
mhm.
guy. Sometimes he seemed to be doing the right thing and sometimes not the right thing. But I think it was the character because he had lack of control a
Mhm.
lot of the time. That was what I found maybe unappealing or disturbing, but I never really got into the Hulk, but the others, like
Yeah.
Captain America, very
Mhm.
obviously on one
Yeah.
side of the spectrum.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that, because as I got older, the gray areas are kind of more of what intrigued me, and kind of trying to find a way through those gray areas, trying to keep
Yeah.
that anachronistic dichotomy of the good guys always win and the good guys always do this, and they never do that. That got a
Hmm.
little It got more fascinating, more realistic for me as I got older. So it's funny that you say that, because yeah, as a kid, it was definitely the very clearly right versus wrong, and now
Hmm.
people seem to be understanding that there is a gray area.
Hmm.
And it's not whether you're good or bad necessarily; it's how you navigate that gray area that determines the outcomes of things.
Hmm. Yeah, and even some of the most interesting comic book stories I've read and stories in general are those which blur the distinction between good and bad. And we see the rise of, I guess, I don't know if there's a term for it, but the sympathetic villain,
Hmm.
a villain who isn't completely bad, but is sort of caught in a situation where a certain course of actions are almost required to accomplish a goal that might be benevolent, but everything just seems to go wrong.
Yeah.
I can't think of a good example of that. I wish I
Um,
could.
you know what was a good example of that, and it wasn't that long ago. If you ever watched, was it NBC? The whatever network is owned by Disney. They Once Upon a Time from like the early 2000s or mid
Hmm.
2000s. All
Hmm.
of those villains had a sympathetic backstory,
Hmm.
which for some of them really seemed to work, and for some of them it seemed like, okay, we're making all the villains into just misunderstood people now. So I think it maybe got
It
a
gets
little
overdone. Yeah.
a little overdone after like season three. It's like, okay, all of these bad guys can't
Hmm.
be sympathetic people who just took a wrong turn. Some people, as
Hmm.
Alfred said in the Chris Nolan Batman, some people just want to watch the world burn. You know,
Yeah.
so
Hmm.
and that's kind of the scary part. The people who are just want to watch the world burn. They're the frightening ones.
Yeah. Or those who just have a completely selfish motive
Hmm.
and are willing to do anything or walk over anybody to achieve that motive
Yes.
or achieve that end. And we see this, I think the it's almost a trope now, but the evil capitalist corporation that will do anything or have any kind of maladjusted agency to
Hmm.
accomplish a certain goal.
Yeah, but at the same time, you see it every day, so
Oh yeah, sure.
it makes sense.
Mhm. So let's go back a little bit to your pre-Avalon creative endeavors. You talked a little bit about how Origins began to evolve. Maybe say a little bit more about that. What was like the first incarnation of, I guess, the White Knight?
Well, yeah, I mean, as we've already talked about, art's always been a big part of my life. It's the career path I chose. After realizing that learning math was just too boring to become an engineer like I had originally planned. But funny enough, just the other week, I found probably the earliest known drawing of the White Knight character.
Mhm.
It's probably from 1984, 1985. His teammates are literally wearing high tech versions of medieval army armor. And, it's so bizarre. One is like a commander of space. One's a tropical defender. It's bizarre.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's a second drawing that I also found that's from about 1987, which is already vastly different. In
Mhm.
that the White Knight character had been in suspended animation from 1987 to 2087.
Oh, okay.
So we're going in completely different realms here. It's like bouncing around like a ping pong ball. So there are many changes over the years. Uh,
Mhm.
some of those changes were because I'd come up with something I thought was really cool, and then all of a sudden I'd see it somewhere. Like there was a version of the White Knight costume with a tall collar, like the old school Nightwing costume, and he had glowing eyes. And
Oh,
then
okay.
all of a sudden, the first issue of Spawn comes out, hits the
Oh
newsstand,
boy.
and there he is, eye colored cape and glowing eyes. I'm like, you got to be kidding me!
Yeah.
I spent so much time coming up with this concept, and someone beat me to the punch.
Right.
And even now, there's probably some things when you look at the costume that you kind of look at other characters. I'm like, yeah, but you know what? I did this before it came out, so I'm keeping it now. I'm not changing it for anybody else.
Hmm.
This is mine.
Yeah.
I came up with it. I'm keeping it. Um,
Hmm.
so over the years, really, the only consistent things were the name White Knight and having a
Hmm.
character named Sinjin. Those are really the only two things that stayed consistent from the very beginning.
Hmm.
Every couple of years, as technology changed and the origin hadn't been published, I had to alter the origin so they
Hmm.
didn't fall behind, and so it stayed up to date with things. That was part of the perfectionist and procrastinator aspects of the imposter syndrome, is that it it was always changing. I could never make any headway in the publishing or the creation because the origin always had to be up to date in my mind to be relevant, to be useful, to be something that someone wouldn't be entertained with.
Hmm.
Um, and then finally, a couple of years ago, I decided that the story would focus more on a younger generation of vigilante wanting to work with the established White Knight character, and that's where we are now. So I think that kind
Hmm.
of helped to give a little bit more of a padding in there between having to redo the origin every couple of years because I had not made any headway in getting it done. So
Yeah, I imagine, and my familiarity with the comic book canon is nowhere near what yours is, but I imagine that coming up with something that at least you feel is original might be a little bit difficult in that realm because it is so saturated with content.
It is, and I think part of that is why I decided to keep with the homages because then I can, it's very clearly that some of these things are being influenced by pop culture, and that kind of makes it okay because you're not stealing anything. You're saying I appreciate this, and this is in the world that this exists as entertainment in the world where this character comes from, and they appreciate it. So yeah, I think that also helped a bit. But you can't keep beating yourself up, or you can't keep yourself from doing something just because you feel like someone else did it.
Right.
It doesn't mean you can't try to do it yourself. It doesn't mean that what you're going to come up with is not going to be better. You have to just it's not maybe not necessarily the creativity, but what you do with it. There are so many themes that are used and reused, from Star Wars, Seven Samurai, basic philosophy, storytelling vehicles that are centuries old that people just take and they put their own spin on it, and it works perfectly well. So you can't be too concerned about whether the idea is 100% original. There's so much going on nowadays that you just can't. You have to do the best you can. If it's homage, make sure that everyone knows it's homage and embrace it.
Yeah, I always saw two aspects to this. I don't want to call it a problem, but two aspects of the issue that I've always wrestled with. And the first is that there are certain problems in society, and there's a zeitgeist, there's a spirit of the times, and these problems, everyone's experiencing them, and they manifest themselves in this way. So there's that, and so all the creators are wrestling with the same issue just in a different way, and I see it kind of like a jazz standard, which is reinterpreted and performed in a different way by a different musician, and thus, I don't want to say owned, but made different and made unique by this musician, but it's still the same core of a jazz standard. And I kind of see, I guess maybe literature in general as reflecting a lot of that as well, and especially in comic books, because you have the superhero thing going on. Okay, so it sounds like we are both children of the 80s.
Yes.
Yeah. You've described yourself as, and I think this is at the end of the book, an unapologetic Trekkie, a sci-fi geek, I'm with you on both of those, a pop culture nerd, and a comic book fanboy. I think we've covered the last one of those, the comic book fanboy. Let's just maybe go in reverse order. As I was reading Origins, I noticed several unrelated, random, and awesome pop culture references, and I'm sure I missed just as many as I noticed. So what are some of your favorites?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Gen X, baby, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, let's start with the elephant in the room that we started off with, the Bonnie Tyler quote from Superhero. As far as I can remember, the lyrics to that song are where I first heard of a white knight.
Okay.
I will say that that's where the character name came from. And I gave full credit for that at the end of the book in the thank you section, because that really did change everything and make all of this kind of possible. It was the catalyst for all of this. I had not yet made the connection between White Knight and Lancelot in the Arthurian legends, but the Bonnie Tyler song, which was huge in '84. Is definitely the beginning of this whole thing. I don't know why, but I was particularly enamored by 80s TV and cartoons, especially if it had an awesome vehicle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Airwolf, Knight
Yeah.
Rider, and I don't know if anyone noticed, but the typography for the title of the book is actually the pretty much the Knight Rider font.
Oh, it is. Okay. I didn't notice that.
It's pretty
Yeah.
much the Knight Rider font. You have Street Hawk, A-Team, Thundercats, Transformers, Thundar the Barbarian. I just
Oh,
finished
yeah.
rewatching Thundar, G.I. Joe, Silverhawks. I mean, it goes on and on.
Mm-hmm.
We had the best television programming in that decade, hands down, the best TV programming that
Yeah.
decade.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm.
Oh my God, it was the best stuff. I mean, some of it actually holds up really well even today. It's kind of odd that we're still dealing with some of the same problems too.
Mm-hmm.
But it was much more. The writing and the action and everything may not have been very sophisticated, but the stories were spot on, and they were fun. They got you to think about
Yeah.
things without being too heady about it.
Mm-hmm.
My wife, as she was editing through the story, got a kick out of the number of aliens references. We quote movies all the time, and probably two of the more frequent quotes we just randomly pull out is Newt's. They mostly come out at night, mostly. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, Hudson's game over, man, game over.
Yeah.
So, but honestly, some of those references are so the pop culture is so ingrained in my psyche that I didn't realize I was making some of these references until as I was reading back through. I'm like, oh, okay. I honestly didn't connect aliens with my character of Hicks until
Mm-hmm.
my wife pointed out the other aliens references. So now I am counting the days until I can find a way to use the "somebody wake up Hicks" quote
Mm-hmm.
in response to that character. So there's just a lot of pop culture that just influenced every part of my early developmental years, and it's so ingrained in there that some of them I didn't realize I was making until I read through them. Like, oh, that's where that came from, and oh, that's where that came from, and
Mm-hmm.
some are named, some are not, and so there's just a whole bunch in there.
Yeah. Well, it's turned into a cultural vocabulary.
It has.
Yeah. For just the way we communicate through movie quotes or through comic book quotes or
Mhm.
tropes like that. So I got to know, is there an Airwolf? I remember watching Airwolf when I was in seventh grade. Is there an Airwolf reference in Origins or not?
There
I didn't pick
are
one up, but
there are actually two big ones. The first, of course, is Sinjin.
mm-hmm.
Sinjin.
Oh, okay.
Sinjin was the name of Stringfellow Hawk's MIA brother in the
Mm-hmm.
ship. And for whatever reason, that name just really stuck with me. Maybe it was because it was spelled like Saint John, but
Yeah.
pronounced Sinjin. And there's little kid me going, that's kind of weird, but that's kind of cool. So the character name of Sinjin came directly from Airwolf. That is a direct homage to that show,
Mm-hmm.
which I loved so much as a kid, and I've probably rewatched at least 3 times since
Mm-hmm.
they started streaming television on these different apps. So there's that. That's the big one. The other one is the Lair. So
Mm-hmm.
in the book, the Knights New Avalon refer to their secret base of operations as the Lair.
Mm-hmm.
And the Lair was also what they named the Monument Valley hiding location for Airwolf.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that.
Oh, okay.
And then, I guess the cello is probably like a tangential reference to Airwolf. I started playing the cello recently because of Airwolf, and
Oh,
I put it in the book because I play. So yeah, we'll call that 2.5 references to Airwolf. So yeah,
a couple of those clicked for me. I haven't watched Airwolf in many, many decades. So yeah, I don't know the details well enough, but now that you mentioned Sinjin, okay, that makes sense to me now. Yeah, I remember really loving that show. Talk to me about the Karl Lagerfeld reference. That one took me really off guard at first. What? And then I read the very end of the book, and I thought, okay, that makes a lot more sense now.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for calling that out in particular, because that is just a little hint at a much larger thing.
Okay, yeah, I
For
got that impression. Okay.
um, I grew up in a time and a place where even if you were LGBTQ plus, you didn't tell anyone you were, right?
Hmm.
So I really didn't know or know of any openly queer people until college.
Hmm.
Uh, and because of the number of amazing friendships I've built since then, I saw adding an LGBTQ plus characters as part of my responsibility as a straight ally. You know,
Hmm.
AJ in the
Hmm.
book is 6'4", all American, built like a brick outhouse kind of guy. And the juxtaposition of that anachronistic idealization of that persona is just perfect. You
Yeah.
know, Sinjin is not only AJ's best friend, he is his chosen family. I think I said chosen brother in
Hmm.
the book. And I know it was probably a little ham fisted, but I really wanted to use that word chosen.
Hmm.
Um, because that one word in that context carries a lot of meaning without going into a lot of detail for people who have needed to find their chosen family.
Hmm.
Sadly, still too many people turn away from their children or other family members when they come out to them.
Hmm.
So I definitely wanted. It was definitely important to express that.
Hmm.
But I also wanted to keep it a little fun too. Throw in like an off the cuff Karl Lagerfeld or other kind of mention or whatever. Keep it kind of light. There's a scene in AJ's apartment where Sinjin is rummaging through AJ's old sports equipment looking for things he can use for costuming. And
Hmm.
the whole exchange is sweet and maybe a little sad, but also funny. There's a
Hmm.
there's a nod to the movie Ghost World, which is probably my wife's favorite pre MCU comic book movie. Specifically, the convenience store scene with Doug, right, the dude with the mullet without the shirt on. It's a problematic scene now because of certain language. But when it came out, it was a hysterical exchange.
Hmm.
And I thought maybe I could take it and use it in such a way to create a supporting comedic exchange that shows the platonic brotherly love between two men, one of
Hmm.
who just happens to be gay, right?
Hmm.
And then you also have Shirley and Gabriella Benito,
Yep.
the sweet, supportive older married couple.
Hmm.
Goes back to a time when that just wasn't done.
Hmm.
The story mentions very briefly some of their struggles, and then the sequel that I'm just about done with continues this practice with the introduction of a character that is not only LGBTQ plus, also indigenous and a domestic violence survivor,
Hmm.
which is calling a special attention to the MMIW movement, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women uh,
Hmm.
movement, which is unfortunately a very real thing that is just now getting some traction in the media and social awareness at large. So, yeah, those little things are kind of hinting at the backstories and the the real meat of the characters and bringing some social awareness
Hmm.
in an entertaining way. So
Yeah. Yeah, and it didn't come across as preachy or anything like that, and that I appreciated a lot. But that reference to Karl Lagerfeld and AJ's costume, I thought, well, what? I thought it was funny at first. I didn't quite get it. It's like, huh? Okay. And then as things progress, I'm like, oh, very well done, very
thank you.
subtle. Yeah, very good there. I also wanted to ask you. I don't know if either of us is really terribly well equipped to talk about this, although you just did quite well. What do you think it is about maybe the comic book, fantasy, video game culture that has been so good for the LGBTQ plus community? Because I've noticed it, and not it's been something that's percolating for a while, I think, or maybe I just haven't noticed it being a middle-aged dude.
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things going on there. I mean, first of all, I think comic books have always been kind of, well, maybe not always, but at a certain point, they kind of shifted from, to more of a, for lack of a better way of saying it, more of a nerd culture. So they were kind of mainstream in the early days, and then they became more and more kind of niche with the superheroes and all of that, and it kind of resonated with people who are nerds and geeks and not exactly the mainstream. And then you have comic books like the X-Men, which has always been a story about the marginalized people without being preachy about it. It's using allegory to kind of express these real world things. So I think titles like the X-Men and things like that, Star Trek especially, allows story to kind of hide a deeper message, a deeper meaning, and in a safe way. And I think credit where credit is due. I think the people who read and watch these things are very smart, and they understand what's going on. They understand that it is, while it is an allegory, it is a reflection on real life. So I think that kind of primes our brains to be in the vanguard for this rise in social acceptance. It's just and two. Being in kind of a fringe community ourselves, these nerds and everything else, especially our generation, Gen X, you had Revenge of the Nerds, you had movies like that where
deeply problematic movie.
It was definitely, we were definitely othered when it comes to society. So we're already kind of in a mindset of, I know what it's like to not be completely accepted, and here are these people who are even less accepted than I am. So let's
having like a similar experience at a much more amplified level. One particular cultural reference I thought was quite clever was to the Arthurian tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It highlights the timelessness, or highlighting the timelessness of this legend was something I really enjoyed in Origins. And maybe could you talk about how this inclusion happened?
Yeah, so I saw Excalibur when I was probably still a little too young to see the movie Excalibur. and I instantly became fascinated with King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and the Arthurian legend, all of that. One of the early concepts of the character of White Knight was that he found an ancient sword while he was cave diving off of England or some such thing, only to find out that it was Excalibur and he was a descendant of King Arthur, and it was a short-lived version of the character. But the underlying inspiration remained. And then, of course, you get into high school and you read the actual poem. You read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I thought that would be a really cool secret military program name. And then you pair it with the Roswell conspiracy of little green men from Mars, and it just makes even more sense for that. So it's always been in the back of my mind. I mean, it's the character's name is White Knight. He carries a sword. He's this modern do-gooder. So it's all kind of baked in there, and again, going back to Excalibur and all of that, so it goes back to, again, like everything else, early on in childhood, just being completely enamored by what I saw, and then learning more about it as I got older and going, that works. That's a really good idea. I'm going to keep that. I'm going to use that. I'm going to take it and make it my own in a way. So
yeah, it's a timeless story.
It is.
And I think it's even in the same chapter where they're going through, this is a couple decades before quote unquote present day.
Yes. One of the
story.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think they're talking to, I think this is a reference to Charlemagne, but it might be General Annius.
Yes.
Says, we have a chaplain with the highest classified clearance levels if you have trouble reconciling any religious beliefs with what you've just seen.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, maybe talk a little. That's one of my favorite parts in
Oh,
the
wow.
novella.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was, honestly, that was kind of just a way of kind of foreshadowing,
Mm-hmm.
events that are going to unfold a little bit further down with
Mm-hmm.
General Keeler.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because you've got loving the whole idea of extraterrestrials and aliens and oh God, what would that mean in real life? You've got the two mindsets. You've got the people who be like, oh, this is awesome. This is going to be fantastic.
Yeah.
Utopia is here. We're going to get, this technology is going to be like Star Trek. We're going to learn how to treat each other perfectly and
Mm-hmm.
well and everything else. And then you've got the other people who are just going to fight against it because it goes against what they have been taught since they were very young.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever that belief may be, there'd be like there's going to be some people are going to be very accepting, and then there's going to be another group of people that are just going to have this complete opposite dig in like a tick kind
Yeah.
of reaction to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to kind of show both sides of that because you
Mm-hmm.
have this entire group of people, this entire team of people who I wouldn't say it's a spoiler for the book, but
Mm-hmm.
because it starts off with the recount of the Roswell crash. That's where the book
Mm-hmm.
starts off. So it's not really you kind of it's kind of obvious that there's going to be some kind of play on that. But you have
Yeah.
this entire group of people who have, for decades have taken this found extraterrestrial technology and have used it to do good things for mankind, advancements in technology. And then you
Mm-hmm.
have a couple of people who are like, no, it doesn't matter. I don't like the cost of this. It doesn't matter what good
Mm-hmm.
happened. I don't agree with it, and therefore I'm going to stop you.
Right. Yeah.
So
It's like an ostrich putting their head in the sand. That's how.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I get some childhood's end vibes with that quote there. And it deals with people confronting an existential crisis that they just want to deal with, realizing that humanity really isn't the center of the universe
Yes.
and that there are other things out there. And yeah, a little nod from my part to Arthur C. Clarke
Oh,
there. We've thus far been referring to Origins as a novella, but in terms of media classification, I think it's a little bit more complicated since there's a fair bit of visual material present. And, so that we have drawings of all the characters, all the main characters, and there are a few pages as well of comic book frames, or what I would
mhm.
call comic book frames. Can you talk about your process there and what your approach was toward making this sort of almost a multimedia?
Yeah. So again, again, it goes back to that perfectionist aspect. I really needed people to see some of these characters exactly as I has created them.
Mm-hmm.
But also as someone who never considered myself a quote unquote writer, I wanted to give a little bit more value to the publication. I was kind of hedging my bets, kind of bumping it up in case the writing was bad. I wanted to have something in there for people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as well as push myself to get back into drawing like I used to when I was younger. For this in particular, and this is where it gets controversial for artists. I used quite a bit of AI
Mm-hmm.
as a tool
Mm-hmm.
to help where my skills had deteriorated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it used to be back in the day, I would scour magazines and comic books for figural references, poses, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And now with AI, I was able to put in some prompts and eventually, but still in less time than the old, have
Mm-hmm.
a decent resource that I could use, import into my apps, and redraw myself in as close to a style that I felt was fitting for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, kind of like the rotoscoping they did on the old animated Lord of the Rings movie,
Oh
and
yeah.
and Thundar, Thundar the
Was it?
Barbarian. I was watching the behind the scenes on the Blu-ray of that, and they did a lot of rotoscoping. They did the footage of people and horses and all of that, and they basically took that and they rotoscoped it over that to get what they wanted or get what they
Mhm.
needed, and then they would reuse that from episode to episode. You have Thundar and Ariel and Ukla on their horses
Mhm.
jumping over some obstacle, and one
Mhm.
episode would be coming from the left to the right, the next episode would be right to left, and they reuse that a lot of times. So it's part of kind of helping me get back into the swing of things, and also again another homage to the way they did things in the old days.
Mhm.
So while I did use AI to help, there's nothing in there that hasn't been altered by my own hands, either
Mhm.
by compiling it and editing it in Photoshop, or redrawing or painting over it with one of my other applications. Um,
Mhm.
I wanted to definitely. I just lost my train of thought.
Oh no,
Uh,
that's okay. Yeah, I see it as another. I see a use of AI as another tool. I mean, it's
it
like using a
is,
brush, and
yes.
there's a long history of very well renowned painters having a ton of assistants
Hmm.
to, like an army
Yeah.
of, I don't know, maybe not an army, but a crew of people who would help them. And okay, I think
Hmm.
Peter Paul Rubens is one of them. But yep, you draw the feathers there. You do this, and you do
Hmm.
this, and yeah, the there's nothing new there at
Yeah.
all. And there's of course a dark side to making
Yes.
use of AI. Especially, I heard a news story where people were using AI to construct very fast coloring books,
Hmm.
and specifically coloring books of dinosaurs. And so the AI would construct or draw a dinosaur for a coloring book that would have like 8 legs or something completely anatomically out there. And that's highly problematic because people
Yeah.
who are writing, or I don't want to say writing, or constructing coloring books in that capacity are going to sell them very cheap.
Yes.
And so you're going to get certain communities that are going to only be able to afford the cheap coloring books. And then the kids
Yes.
who are going to use those coloring books are going to get distorted ideas of what anatomy looks like. And so there's some real harm that comes like that.
Yeah.
In other situations, it just removes a lot of the laborious legwork that would otherwise be required.
Yeah, it does, and again, it all depends on how you use it. Again, if you're using it
Mm-hmm.
as reference,
Yeah,
it's really not much different than pulling someone's photograph from a fashion magazine and using that as
sure.
a body reference,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever the case may be. It's all in how you use it. I remember back when Photoshop still fit on a floppy disk. And I remember people talking about how Photoshop was going to be the end of photographers. And it really
Mm-hmm.
wasn't. It
Yeah.
what it did is it helped make things better. You could concentrate more on the creative aspect of it and less on the minutia,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and for me with this, it really did help get me past certain humps and speed bumps and a way help with, again, the perfectionism and the
Yeah.
parallelization. All of that, it helped get me to a point where I felt confident in what I was doing again, which helped get all of this finished from or accomplished from start to finish. So
Mm-hmm.
again, it's not the AI, it's how you use it,
Sure.
whether or not you credit the AI or not. I have no problem saying, listen, I used it as a reference tool. I used it to help me with some of the things I was falling short on, but I ultimately went in and made these changes. I made the artwork from these references. And the
Mm-hmm.
frustrating thing about AI is it's notoriously bad with hands, and I am notoriously bad at drawing hands. So it didn't help me at all with that. So the thing I probably did the most did absolutely nothing for me.
Yeah.
But it really did help make me feel a little bit more confident, or get me back up to speed to a point where I felt like, okay, this will work for me for right now, for getting this out there.
Okay.
So
Yeah. When photography came around, I'm sure, in fact, I know for a fact, many people were saying something similar about photography. It was going to put painters out of business, and especially, portrait artists.
Yeah. I think, and this is kind of a tangent. I think AI, artists are afraid that AI is going to eliminate their job, their livelihood. I think what AI is going to do ultimately, I think AI is going to eliminate clients who are not viable from their radar. Not everyone can afford to have an artist do a cover illustration or do this or do that. I did a logo not too long ago for a friend, and I did it on the cheap because it was a friend and I could work in my own time frame. So, there was no need for me to charge what I would normally have charged. But not everyone can make a living like that. So, the AI, you have all these people like, well, how about I get the friends and family discount too? It's like, well, no, dude, I can't do that for you. I can't do that for everyone.
Yeah. Sure.
So the people who want to do these initiatives, who want to do these things, who can't afford professionals to do it, may rely on AI. And these are people that you wouldn't have been able to work with anyway because they couldn't afford to pay you for your time to do this creative endeavor. So I think ultimately it's going to allow people who don't necessarily have the financial means to still do creative things.
Oh, okay. That's a good way of putting it.
Without constantly harassing artists to do things for free or to do it for the notoriety or whatnot. It's like it takes them out of the equation. So now the artists can, they don't have to navigate those people when they're looking for viable paying clients. And those people will have AI and they can do their creative thing and people will know. I mean, it'll be obvious that it's AI, but people will be like, okay, we get it. You couldn't do the traditional means, but you still have your creative endeavor out there the best you could for what you could afford to do and all of that. So I think it opens some doors and I think it will streamline things for other artists and keep them from having to deal with people. Not all of them are bad. Some of them just unfortunately can't pay.
Right, or they're just not familiar with the process and how things are generally done, and they have an unrealistic set of expectations of what something should cost or what kind of work goes into it.
Yeah. So I don't think AI is the monster everyone thinks it is. There are obviously some dark sides to it. There is, it's stealing people's artwork, and it is. It is taking bits of style here and bits of style there, and all of that. But at the same time, they've already done court cases that say you cannot copyright text prompted AI. So there's no real need to worry about, people. People are not going to be able to really take this and run with it to the extent that people are they're afraid that they will. So,
yeah, it's not going to make a bad novelist a good novelist.
Exactly, but it will let that bad novelist complete a book and finish a dream.
Right.
Yeah,
that's true.
You get that out there, and it might lead them to writing another novel and then another novel, and eventually they'll get good at writing the novel, and then it will be, it takes a lot of that impediment out of there for some people. So.
Yeah, and it will certainly save time for a good novelist already.
Yes.
I want to look at another aspect of what I've been calling a multimedia presentation of your novella, and it's interesting because at one point, St. John, the book is told from St. John's perspective, but through video.
Yes.
Video journalism or video journals, and the background of the page changes, the text changes, the writing style changes. And have you thought about maybe taking this a step further, or did it occur to you to take this a step further? And we're in the age of digital presentation right now, and have that. I think you see where I'm going with this.
Yes.
For the question I'm asking,
I would love to do multimedia. I think the story and the characters and everything would lend itself well to that. It's more of a matter of bandwidth with time.
Okay.
for
Yeah.
creating these things than physical limitations. Um,
Hmm.
Social media has almost limitless possibilities.
Hmm.
Um, and I would absolutely love to see this animated one day. Netflix and Amazon, reputations towards creatives aside, have produced some
Hmm.
really great, limited animated series.
Hmm.
Um, so I would love to, at some point down the road, do something with multimedia, social media, that kind of thing. The the comic book panel pages are a part of the last large scale false start about 12 years ago or so. And as I was writing, I thought, where can I fit these into the story?
Hmm.
And the journal section that you were talking about, that I placed them in, was a way to quickly span a year of training for our heroes without it causing any kind of like lag in the story or anything like that. And do it in an
Yeah.
interesting way, and in a way that still leaves some room for future exploration of that time period.
Yeah.
And it's also yet another homage to the 80s and the great training montages of those movies. You have Revenge of the Nerds, Rad, Rocky. Those are just the R's.
Yeah.
So I kind of see that video training, or that video archive of Sinjin's training, that time period of that year, calling out specific dates, just little quips and little sound bites. I kind of see that as the 80s training montage
Yeah.
of the book.
Hmm. Yeah, but doing that through him, like speaking to the camera instead of showing people doing really cool stuff, hitting stuff, and lifting weights and doing that kind of training, but him narrating sort of how he feels during the whole training period, I thought was very well done in
Thank you.
show don't tell capacity.
Thank you. I kind of wanted to play with doing it, changing from third person to first person.
Hmm.
Um, I'm a fan of Dean Koontz, and he did this really great series for the character Odd Thomas.
Hmm.
And all of the books are written in first person. And
Hmm.
it was just very, it was, you're used to reading in third person with these narratives and these stories. And so just having a story that's written in first person, just it felt so much more personal.
Hmm.
And I felt like, it'd be interesting to try that. And it takes that period of time in the book that could have just been just one long, you know, snooze of a writing with the training,
Hmm.
and it makes it a little bit more personal. You kind of get more
Hmm.
into his head, and you
Hmm.
kind of see where he's directly thinking about these things, and it really brings you more into the story. And who doesn't want to relate directly to someone training to be a superhero? I mean, that's
Sure.
every kid's
Yeah.
dream, is to be
Yeah.
a superhero. So it kind of gets you into that mindset of that first person. And I'm glad that you appreciated that section for what it was. So
So there are definitely some sequel vibes and series vibes coming near the end. And you've already mentioned that you have one in the works or that's almost ready for publication.
yes, I actually just finished the second round edits for the sequel, and it's, fingers crossed, just a couple of weeks from hitting the publish button.
Hmm.
Um, it's called Sirens, and it mostly focuses on some of the strong female characters of the Knights of New Avalon universe.
Hmm.
Mara, who is introduced late in the pages of Origins,
Hmm.
has a very large role to play with this story, and I love writing for her. Her Irish accent. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
she can be. She's probably one of the more vulgar characters, but because we're replacing a U with an E, it doesn't quite read as
Right.
vulgar. It's a lot of fun writing her like that. It also introduces Crimson Thorn, who is the indigenous vigilante that I mentioned earlier.
Hmm.
And I absolutely love writing for that character as well. Charlie Martin, Charlemagne's daughter,
Oh,
uh,
right. Yeah.
has a big part to play in the sequel. After Origins, I felt a little disappointed by her character. So the story really digs in and saves her from being a flat character, a one-dimensional clone of her father, which is great. Um, to go back to the multimedia, the different treatments and whatnot, there are still a number of illustrations in the sequel. A couple of the panel style pages, written flashbacks, and visual accents for some of them. None of St. Jin's journal entries, though. I wanted to focus more on Mara and the other characters. I did keep the general flashbacks. The chapters in Origins that are set apart by the italicized text. I really enjoy using flashbacks to inform on current events instead of exposition. Um, I love Highlander, the TV show.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
And one of the things that made that show so good and so memorable was the use of flashbacks to different points in McLeod's long life.
Yeah.
And I think it works well in a series as we're slowly learning the past of Project Gawain and how that relates to now. And then there's also a massive, massive twist that I didn't want to spoil with too much of that unique treatment. So I kept that pretty straightforward. We finally find out who Canon is in real life.
Okay.
And it is a doozy. I mean,
Okay.
some of the spoilers, some of the twists in Origins were big. This one is massive. So
I thought he was Hicks at first, but then that turned out not to be the case. Yeah. And also, that would have been a little bit too obvious. Yeah.
Well, if you're a fan of the Hicks character, I will say Hicks comes back, and Hicks is featured prominently in the story. And one of the things I like about the Hicks character is, at least in Origins anyway, he's the one character there is absolutely no description of.
Yeah.
So it's up to you. It's up to the reader to go, what does this guy look like? What does he sound like? In my mind, I kind of picture him as kind of like a Christian Slater type. But, I don't go into that detail. So what other people read into it could be completely different. Now, in the sequel, there is a little bit more that might lead to, some kind of confines as far as what the character may look or sound like or anything like that. But for the most part, Hicks was kind of my way of saying, hey, you guys get to decide what this guy looks like, what he sounds like. You see the words on the page, but what does his voice sound like in your head as you're reading through, and what does he look like? So he's been an open-ended character, and he was just a lot of fun to write for. So
I find leaving things like that open-ended leads to a much more engaging read, because it does place some responsibility on the reader to engage and to use and for the reader to use his or her imagination there. And I appreciate that a lot more, because when everything is laid out and very clear, it makes me a lazy reader when I read books like that. That's how I feel.
For me, it was very difficult to let go of the reins of creativity, to leave it open like that, when everything else was so thoroughly planned out and planned and designed ahead of time. To leave a character like Hicks open like that was very hard. It very much went against my comfort zone. But by doing so, it really did help in the long run overcome some of those other obstacles I've had with the perfectionism and having to be perfect and having absolute control over these things. So, exploring little things like that a little at a time really helped overcome some of those earlier obstacles and hurdles that I had. So,
Rusty, it's been wonderful talking with you. This has been a really wonderful conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Where can we find you on social media?
So I am on most of the older person social media, Facebook, Twitter, Threads. Twitter is really just more of a way station, pointing people to the other sites. When you read the book and you kind of see my point of view of things, you can kind of see why Twitter is really just pointing to other places on social media.
Yeah.
White Knight 714, should get people there, through those other websites. They're pretty consistent across the boards.
Okay. So
Threads.
you do have your own website, I assume.
I do not. Well, I have a portfolio site for
Oh, okay.
my career. Um, for Knights of New Avalon specifically, I have a dedicated Facebook page, which
Okay.
is Facebook/Knights of New Avalon in one
Hmm.
long thing.
Okay.
It has some posts of in progress works and things like that. I'm hoping to eventually do a standalone website at some point, but I really need to finish up the sequel and start the marketing before I kind of get into the weeds on that. So.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, if you could just email me links to all of those, and I'll put them in the show notes.
Absolutely.
Right. We've been talking a long time. And
Yeah. I was
yeah.
I was concerned I wasn't going to have enough to talk about.
There was no problem there developing conversation. Yeah. So it's been wonderful having you on, and I wish you all the best and success as an author and as a creator.
Thank
And
you.
I hope
I
to stay in
appreciate it.
touch.
Thank you so much.